Okay, ladies and gentlemen, sorry for the delay. Unfortunately, Mev was on a delayed train. We also didn't want to start without an equal canon. Firstly, thank you very much and welcome to the final of the Neverendum series, the EU debate. That's where you're meant to clap, please. In Jeb Bush, please clap. Okay, the format tonight will be very simple, much like the other debates that we've done. I will ask each panel member to give 3 minutes strict. I will be cutting you off at the 3-minute section-ish. To give a speech on their side of the argument. We'll then have 2 main questions which I will go for audience participation. 2 main questions will be around, obviously, education. We are in a university setting after all. And the other one will be around graduates, jobs and businesses. Okay, and again, I'm very encourage audience participation throughout the whole event. Once we've got through that and we've had enough discussion, we'll then open the floor up to any other questions that both students and staff and wider public have on the question. Obviously, the EU referendum is going to be a huge decision. We've just had an election very recently, and we're going into another one in just over a month's time. So I will ask Molly, please, will you start with your opening words?
I will. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, cool. So good afternoon, thank you very much for having me along today. My name is Bonnie Sandlin and I'm the President of the National Union of Students in Scotland. I'm here today actually representing the pro-EU Scotland Stronger In campaign. It's a proud European. And so I will, true to form, as some in the room will be expecting from a representative of a national student organisation, begin my argument for why Britain should absolutely remain part of the EU by talking about cheap package holidays, and I'm only half joking. Because I'm definitely a fan of a cheaper and easier travel, but not even a cheap tan is more important than the other benefits of our global citizenship. Now, my experience is obviously with further and higher education, and as a sector, I think that actually we reflect the level of cooperation across the EU in an exemplary manner. Excuse me. Scotland has a world-class tertiary education system. Our undergraduate, postgraduate and doctorate studies attract applications internationally, and our institutions benefit from a socially, culturally and ideologically rich talent pool, and all of which makes for a much more progressive and diverse experience, not only in terms of learning and teaching or indeed research, but on a social level too, with dynamic and intelligent student cohorts with different and complementary life experiences. I believe that such a broad outlook challenges us and inspires us too to be better than the sum of our parts. Now, I believe that we absolutely must encourage free movement to study and learn, not only to further academic opportunities and a knowledge economy, but to encourage a generation of global citizens and to foster social cohesion. Like many aspects of the debate, when we examine the benefits of student mobility on the individual and on society, it can be easy to fixate on the economic, but it's the social and the cultural benefits that are harder to measure, but which provide some of the most powerful rewards. Freedom of movement has given us such diverse communities and campuses too, and I certainly know that when I was still a student, it was something that I very much benefited from. It's enabled younger generations to experience an educational journey alongside students and academics from all corners of the globe, expanding their cultural and their social knowledge and understanding. It's contributed to the creation of cohesive communities, to a socially tolerant society, and a Brexit would not just limit the diversity of our campuses, but risk reversing the current outward-looking international culture of our education system. But I know that students aren't just concerned about the impact of a Brexit on universities, but on the broader insularity that would ensue as well. My generation is connected to young people around the world more than ever before, with globalised networks, campaigning collectively on global issues. We don't fear this diverse international world. What we fear is isolation. And our institutions benefit greatly too from being part of the European Union. The EU provides research funding to support collaborative projects between universities, something which has actually recently been highlighted by Jo Johnson, the Minister at UK level, as a major boon to UK science and competitiveness, which is providing interesting and diverse opportunities for research and then potentially for jobs too. And of course, that benefit and diverse student recruitment to our institution is flipped, as students from the UK have opportunities available to study through the Erasmus scheme, named of course after that strong opponent of dogmatism, a scheme which is 29 years old and was created to support and enhance that belief that international mobility is inherently good.
Okay, Bonnie, I'm going to have to...
Can I?
Yeah.
Is that okay? So for the complicated world that lies ahead, it makes absolutely no sense to look anything but outwards. I'm proud to be not only an officer for the National Union of Students in Scotland, but also the National Union of Students in the UK, and a member of the European Students' Union too. It's a clear example of the next generation taking up responsibility for fostering peace and prosperity and working together to protect the future of the next generation, which is incredibly important. And we're able to do that now as members of the European Union. So I hope that you'll agree that we absolutely must remain as part of the EU. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Next on the line we have Braden Davey from the Assistant Director of Local Leave. So Braden, you have the floor for 3 minutes.
Hello, my name is Braden. I'm actually a student at Dundee University as well, and I am not an isolationist, contrary to what has been said. I believe in an outward-looking Scotland, a global Scotland, and I believe the best way to do that is by voting Leave in this referendum. Now, there's lots of reasons why you should vote Leave, but I'm going to focus on one. It's the only way we can save free tuition in Scotland. Now, currently, European law requires Scotland to provide free tuition from students from every single country in the European Union. So a country of 5 million has to provide free tuition for the students of 420 million. This is estimated to cost the Scottish taxpayer around £80 million every year. Now, not only is it inherently expensive to provide this, but it also competes Scottish students out of the system. EU law discriminates or disallows Scottish universities to discriminate in favour of Scottish students. So we see if more EU students attend Scottish universities, less Scottish students attend because it is one pool and they compete for the same level of places. And we've seen that at universities. Dundee University, the number of Scottish students attendance fell by 9%, Glasgow 8%, St Andrews 4%, while the number of EU students has soared. Now, we're not arguing that EU students shouldn't come to Scotland. I'm just saying that they should have to pay tuition fees just like me. And what this would mean is that the amount of money available for Scottish students would increase. Dundee University is facing a £10 million cut to its budget, decimating humanities and decimating languages. Now, I study Spanish as part of my degree here. Now, the best way we can make sure we invest in the university and provide spaces for students from Scotland is by leaving the European Union and using the money that we'd gain from charging EU students, the same as we charge English, Welsh and Northern Irish students, and using that to invest in spaces and invest in facilities for Scottish people. Now, I think there's something inherently unfair with a system where a student from Lochee struggles to gain access to university at, say, for example, Dundee, because not only are they competing against students from Scotland, they're competing against the top tier of students from across the entire European Union, 420 million students. And this is only going to get worse as Turkey joins, Albania joins, Serbia joins the European Union. More students will be able to gain access to the European Union. Now, also, I take issue with the fact that free movement wouldn't exist or Erasmus wouldn't exist. Iceland's in Erasmus, Norway's in Erasmus, Switzerland's in Erasmus. Lots of countries are in the Erasmus scheme without actually being in the European Union. And of course, we're opting to pay for things like that. But the best way that we can ensure that free tuition is protected for Scots, and the best way that we can ensure it goes forward, is by voting to leave the European Union. Decisions about who the Scottish Parliament or who the Scottish people should provide free tuition for should be a decision by the elected government of the people of Scotland, the Scottish Parliament. It shouldn't be up to unelected officials in Brussels to dictate to the Scottish people who they can and can't provide free access to, who Dundee can or can't let into the university. So to make sure that free tuition is protected going forward, the only way to do that is by voting Leave in this referendum.
Thank you, Braden. Okay, Pete.
Well, thank you very much. I think tracing what we just heard, the idea that Scottish universities should be for Scottish students is to me a highly parochial and narrow view, quite contrary to the point that was being made. But let me just turn to my own key points that I want to make. The first is that universities should be places for evidence-based discussion and debate, and all of our staff and students should have full freedom of expression of their views, and that's what this evening is all about. Within that context, I'm here to express my personal views, and those views are based on 27 years as an academic, a professor of biochemistry, 7 years at the helm of this great university, and 4 years as convener of University of Scotland. And I believe that Scotland's universities are not only stronger in Europe, but would be impoverished if the UK were to leave the European Union. Now, it's not just about the money, although £86 million of investment in research and regional development funds over 8 years in Dundee, which is a city, as we've already heard, with more than its fair share of economic problems, tells its own story. It is, though, about the people. Talented students and staff from every European nation, many with skills in science, technology, engineering and maths subjects, which are in short supply in Scotland. These people are flocking to study and work in our laboratories and classrooms, and they bring cultural richness and diversity to the campus and to the city. And on a much larger scale, it's about collaboration and cooperation amongst many of the most enlightened nations of the world. So let me put some numbers to the impact for Dundee of that human mobility issue within the EU. Currently in Dundee, in the university, there are about 1,000 EU students, 19,000 or so in Scotland as a whole. Our student president-elect, sitting just over there and trying to disappear now, is Indra Urbanavdishuta, is one such European student, and I'm very proud that she chose to come to Dundee. They spend about £5 million in Dundee in their expenses, and that figure that we heard, 80 million, I thought it was 90 million pounds, the cost to Scotland of those students having free tuition here is offset by the 150 million or more of off-campus spend of those students. But it's not about the money, it's about the talent. 16% of academic staff, 23% of research staff across Scotland come from the EU. In Dundee, that's more than 350 staff in all categories. So EU membership has a massive impact on the talent pool available to Scotland. It isn't about saying that Scottish jobs for Scottish people, Scottish places for Scottish people. It's about talent. Talent is in rare supply, and we need to go international in order to bring the very best people here. So international excellence, that we've heard from Bonnie, means we have to attract international talent, which also fuels innovation, economic growth, and all the things that Scotland so badly needs. EU membership also means our universities have access to many of the great scientific instruments of our time. Sharing the cost of major scientific infrastructure is efficient and promotes collaboration and creates the collaborative environment we have for research across the European Union. I've already mentioned the figure of £86 million of EU investment in Dundee. That leads to £200 million of impact because that has a knock-on effect on real jobs for those Scottish residents of our city and region. So it's enormously important to fuel economic drive within our region. And more than that, EU membership supports research collaboration, because the kind of funding that comes from the EU is of a different kind than that we find from the UK. It supports interaction between academic units in the UK and throughout Europe, but also brings in companies and businesses to work within that environment. And that is qualitatively different from the kind of research that we tend to do with our own funds. So this has a massive impact on innovation and the ability of universities to interact with industry and business. And to be succinct, in my final statement, EU exit would be disastrous for this university. Hence, it will be disastrous for Dundee and Tayside. And those same arguments apply across even larger numbers of universities and cities that are supported by universities across Scotland and the UK.
Okay, thank you, Pete. Finally, we have Mev. Thank you for joining us, Mev. And the floor is yours.
My name is Mev Brown. I'm a spokesperson for Business for Britain in Scotland. Obviously, our interest is primarily the economic arguments. At the end of the day, governments don't create wealth. They create an environment for business and industry to create wealth. They can make it easier or harder for business and industry in that respect. From that, wealth is taxed to provide public services, including education, which allows a society to grow and prosper. From a business perspective, Scotland's education system is broken. I was looking at a recent government report that showed figures between 2008 and 2014, where 300,000 college places had reduced to 150,000. Now, I spoke to a Scottish government spokesperson. They were talking primarily about leisure and recreation courses. I looked into the figures on the website, and it showed that 16% of engineering places have been cut, 40% of business studies courses have been cut, 55% of IT courses have been cut, and the list goes on to cover key areas of the Scottish economy. The Scottish education system is creating a skills shortage and is failing to deliver for school leavers the education that they are rightly entitled to. The college places are vital for Scotland's economy. A Federation of Small Businesses poll named the skills shortage as their members' highest concern, not higher taxes. Brexit would have several benefits. Firstly, it would force the Scottish Government to fix the broken education system. It would force the Government to increase opportunities for school leavers, and it would lower demand effectively on other public services such as housing and the NHS. Brexit, there is a Brexit dividend we estimate to be 1.5 billion, and that would provide more money for EU for education, as well as safeguarding tuition fees, free tuition fees. Business needs less red tape and bureaucracy, and that's something Brussels is very good at producing. Apparently, they've produced 52,000 EU directives since 2000. That is a major problem for Scottish business to deal with. And beyond that, I'd add two further points. Nobody's talking about ending the Erasmus programme. I think everybody accepts and recognises the benefits of that programme in terms of the benefits. I mean, I worked in international recruitment. I used to recruit people to work in the States. Now, anybody gets an opportunity to work in a foreign country or train in a foreign country should take it. It really enhances your life experience. And beyond that, in terms of EU funding for Scottish education, that is basically British money going to Europe and coming back and being spent by Brussels. It's our money. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so like I said earlier, the first set of questions is going to be around higher education and further education, actually. And one thing that obviously Scottish students will be very aware that when you get to go to university in Scotland, it's free at point of use. So the question really to all panel members, and I'm going to start off with Pete, is how will we sustain free higher and further education if we stay within the EU?
Well, the issue of free higher education in Scotland is a political issue. It's a political choice, and it's supported currently by the people of Scotland in terms of their voting inclinations in recent years, including the Holyrood elections that we've just completed. So that's a political choice. As a consequence of EU membership, therefore, almost the fundamental rationale requires that there is freedom of movement, and therefore that those students from elsewhere in the EU should have access to the same opportunities, just as our students have the same access to whatever is available, whatever is the standard approach to higher education in other European countries. Now, I can support some of the figures that were talked about by others. In Dundee, the number of EU students over the last several years has increased by about 25%. It is still just below 10% right now. I would argue that those students absolutely enrich the experience, not just of their own educational experience, but for every single student here in Dundee. Who here wants our students to be educated in a monoculture? How many of you want to be part of a university with international students who bring an understanding of cultures from around the world? Who wants to leave Dundee with a degree and an experience that equips you to be global citizens? Now, I believe I'm running a university with the objective of introducing everybody who works and studies here to the international opportunities that are available to you. Equally, I'm supporting and trying to work my hardest to ensure that the university supports the economic growth and development of our city. I don't believe that will happen if the only people that we consider should be available to our universities are Scots students.
Sorry, that's not what I've said.
I know you relate it to the payment of fees, but this comes back to the fundamental decision of the Scottish Government and the Scottish people that supports the idea of free higher education. And within the EU, that's free higher education for all of its citizens who choose to come to Dundee. What I'm arguing is that all of those students contribute enormously to the talent pool that's available to this university, and that's true for staff as well as students, and ultimately to the economy of this region. Because unlike our overseas non-EU students, our EU graduates can remain here and contribute to our economy. And in the event of Brexit, it's not at all clear what their visa status would be. Those people who come here, study here, and then contribute to the economy may well have to leave subsequently because they would not have a visa that would allow them to stay.
Okay, great. Obviously, you're
because
to say something.
Because it's absolutely a load of nonsense what he said. He's putting words in my mouth at the idea that we're going to create a monoculture in Scotland. But EU students pay tuition fees in England, and England goes, I pay tuition fees in Scotland, and I'm here. The concept that EU students.
The English system is anything.
No. But the idea that we should treat European students the same as we treat English, Welsh, and Northern Irish students isn't a ridiculous concept. I'm arguing for fairness in the system. That if Scotland wants to be a global player, it doesn't make sense to me that we kick out students from China or India or America or Canada who've come here because they don't meet the criteria yet. For someone from, say, for example, Romania who doesn't have any qualifications.
International student numbers aren't counted against EU and Scottish.
No, but that's my point. Is at the minute, the question was, how can we make sure we continue to protect free tuition in the European Union? We can't. It's simply impossible because the number of EU students will continue to rise, and these students compete against Scottish students for places. Now, I'm not saying that EU students shouldn't come to university. That's a ridiculous thing to say. I'm appalled that they think that's what I'm suggesting. All I'm saying is that EU students should be treated the same as English, Welsh and Northern Irish students. I don't see that's a particularly radical thing to say. Most people in Scotland don't think that's a particularly radical thing to say if you look at opinion polls. And the money that is expected to generate is about £200 million a year if fees were charged. The same as in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. EU students continue to study at these universities in these countries, and they will continue to do so. International students will continue to study in Scotland. But the key thing is, we won't discriminate based on what continent someone happens to be born into.
Okay, can I just respond with
please.
one very brief thing? So the equation is this. It costs currently, with the current number of EU students in Scotland, it costs 90 million, we believe. You could say 80 million, I'm happy with that. In terms of the cost of the EU fees. The gain to the Scottish economy is a minimum of £150 million from the spend of those students in Scotland, around about 17 million from postgraduate students who are paying fees from the EU. And therefore, if Scotland wants to increase the number of places available in its universities, it's perfectly capable of doing so because it's receiving economic benefit from those who come. So it's complete nonsense to say that those who come from the EU must necessarily prevent Scottish students from going to university.
They compete exactly in the same places.
I think I'll head over to Mev here on this issue.
I think one obvious point is when you look at EU students going into England, obviously they have to pay fees. There is no harm to the Scottish system to raise an extra £18 million in fees against with the EU students. There's no harm in that at all. It's not, and you're not discriminating against them.
Yeah, I wouldn't trade EU membership for £80 million of fees.
We're trading it for £20 billion and the ability to have.
Bonnie, obviously, as the NUS Scotland president, you represent also EU students within Scotland. Dundee has, as Pete said, over 1,000 EU students. What would you add to that?
Oh, I have many things. So the first thing to correct actually, and I do actually have some authority in this as I am a board member for the Scottish Funding Council, there are not 300,000 missing college places. I think if there was 300,000 random young people roaming the streets of Scotland with nothing to do, we would have noticed by now. What actually happened was that the Scottish Funding Council reallocated how they classify college courses So if you were a student who was doing 4 6-week courses through the duration of an academic year, you would be counted as 4 students. And what they did was they moved away from the sums model to a head count model, which made it look like there was a dramatic loss of courses. There wasn't. There was, don't get me wrong, an absolutely significant impact on older learners. The Scottish Government's Opportunities for All agenda for colleges guarantees a place in education, work or training for all post-16 young people leaving school. That's an absolutely fantastic thing. Is it an absolutely wonderful utopia system in our education system? No, of course it's not. But the idea that removing European students out of that will suddenly make our education system wonderful and golden is just so parochial that it really concerns me. To talk about benefits of £1 billion here and £2 billion there and £200 million in a year from tuition fees. From between 2014 and 2020, in 6 years, there are 17 operational programmes under EU structural funds which are being delivered in Scotland and in the UK. That's £8.3 billion just from those 17 operational programmes. As well as that, every single college in Scotland benefits from EU funding that is delivered specifically to support people who would have no chance of accessing education, in order to support them to come in and do kind of access courses that allow further education and subsequently higher education to be an actual opportunity for people like me. I came back into education at the age of 30 because I'd been made redundant from the civil service. And my job was gone because of the financial crisis. I had 4 young children and I had no educational opportunities at all. And what ensured that I was able to was an EU-funded programme, an access programme that let me go into college and to do some further study and then to go on and do an HNC and then to get into university to allow me to train and now to represent the 600,000 students in Scotland who I am very, very proud to do, including our EU students who are incredibly important to the dynamics of our institutions. And again, I would just reiterate with the Erasmus scheme, yes, there are countries that are not part of the EU who are involved in Erasmus, but it's the EU that supports the development of Erasmus and of the Bologna process. The Bologna process is the political process that ensures that if you decide you want to do your first year in Scotland and your second year in France and your third year in Germany, that the credits mean the same and that doing your second year in Germany doesn't devalue the degree process that you're going through. It's a magnificent process and I heartily encourage all of you to get involved in an Erasmus exchange if you can. And one last thing I wanted to say is Braden made a comment about local students being squeezed out of Scottish institutions. I have better aspirations for the students from coming from poor areas that they will only study at Scottish institutions. I want every student to have an opportunity to travel abroad, study abroad, be a global citizen, take advantage of the opportunities that are available to them. The same restrictions that mean the EU students here can take advantage of free tuition mean that Scottish students going to Germany can also have free tuition. This isn't a zero-sum game. We are not the net contributors to the EU. We are actually net benefactors. For every household that pays, I think it's £360 a year, we get £3,000 a year per family back from being part of the EU. We actually significantly benefit from being part of the EU. It does not make any sense to me.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we've had a chance to take up on that first initial forum. This is where audience participation is very much welcome. Stuart, my lovely assistant to the left of me here, will be running up and down. We have one question in the back. It's Aaron at the back there. I think wants to right at the back, Stuart, if you want to run up there. We have to wait for the mic because it's getting broadcasted.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
So we've heard a lot about international talent, but I think that what the Remain campaign can pretend to be doing is representing international talent. Because actually what you're representing is European talent, and what the Leave campaign wants to represent is everyone else in the world having equal opportunity to compete for those places instead of discriminating and giving Europeans more opportunities to compete for those places when they might be less talented than their international counterparts. So I would actually say that the international talent is being won on the Leave campaign side.
Okay, Pete, I think you can respond to this.
Yeah,
are we being favourites?
I've heard this argument before. It seems that the argument is this, that we will make the talent of the world more likely to come to Scotland or to the UK if we make it harder for European talent to come to the UK. I think that's a fallacious argument.
Yeah,
how does giving non-EU students equal opportunities to come to Scotland disadvantage EU students? I mean, it's the talent, as you said, it's the talent, not where you come from, that counts.
Yep.
Bonnie, I think you're...
Do you know what? This is the exact argument that is being used by the Conservative government at Westminster to introduce £9,000 a year tuition fees to students studying any course in England, including nursing, where you see NHS students whose actual labour is what is propping up the NHS system in England and being charged £9,000 a year and being charged a living costs
Bonnie,
loan on
this
top of
isn't
that.
England.
Can you let me finish, please? The idea that introducing tuition fees will somehow make access fairer is absolute nonsense. It doesn't make it fairer, it makes it more difficult, it makes access more challenging. It means families from poorer backgrounds who are absolutely debt averse will not even consider the opportunity of paying to go to higher education, and it's a loss. Actually, providing the opportunity for education in this country is a magnificent leveller, and it ensures that people who otherwise would not have an opportunity to go into education have that opportunity. And the idea as well that somehow we're discriminating against home students. EU students have to compete against home students in order to secure their place, and it is then down to talent, it's down to qualifications, and it's down to who is the best fit for the institution. And coming at Dundee University as well, which has 33% of students coming from the 40% poorest postcodes in Scotland, that's something to be incredibly proud of, not something to be fearful of.
Okay. I'm going to think, Med, you wanted to respond quickly there, and then I'll come to Braden.
I mean, I think on many points we're on the same page. I mean, nobody's talking about scrapping your residence or withdrawing from it. You seem to be having that conversation to yourself. In terms of the, nobody's talking about that at all. If any, sorry.
Braden, would you?
No, I have experienced this because I went to university first time and I had to drop out because I couldn't afford the bursaries, I couldn't afford to live. And the only access that there was to Dundee University, they were only accepting students that paid tuition fees at the time, rather than free home students. And yet we've seen, there's a quote with the Glasgow University, I think it was the rector, I've got it in here, who said that the number of, he's worried about the access for Scottish students attending university because, as everyone has mentioned, EU students compete exactly for the same places. Now I'm in a special category, because I'm classed as English, so I don't compete against Scottish students for free tuition. So universities in Scotland can welcome as many English, Welsh and Northern Irish people as they wish. Yet because EU students are in exactly the same pool, competing for exactly the same places, more EU students attending directly correlate with less Scottish students attending. If there's 1,000 places and more are taken up by EU students, less will be taken up by Scottish students. That's just a fact. And there's not an unlimited pool of money. This suggestion that because they spend on, crisps in Tesco, it works out as the Scottish government's earning more money. That's not really how the finance works. The government is spending £80 million, and the government would get back £200 million if EU students were charged. That's money that can reverse the cuts to bursaries for the poorest students. 9% of the poorest background students attend university in Scotland, compared to 17% in England. Why is that? I'd hazard a guess because the students who are competing for places at free tuition in Scotland are competing against students from 420 students from countries where the population totals 420 million. And how much worse is it going to get if we vote Remain and our elected government has no control? For example, Turkey plans to join the European Union, Serbia plans to join the European Union. Free tuition costs will continue. It is a fact that Turkey will join the European Union, but the cost, if you don't want Turkey to join the European Union, then vote leave. It's the easiest way to do it. But the cost.
You're referencing Glasgow University's rector, who's an American guy hanging out in Russia because he's, got some massive criminal case pending against him. They don't think he's ever set foot in.
What about a university of college?
Hasn't ever set foot
the
in
university
a university and has no idea what a Scottish education
you claim to speak up
looks
for Dundee
like.
University, but Dundee University isn't even in the NUS.
Well, that's a subject for another day. Let's not go to that debate. Obviously, guys, audience participation is welcome. Does anybody have any more questions around higher education? Yep, this gentleman down at the front here.
We're just best mates for the day.
Yeah.
Okay. I come from Aberdeen University, which is down the road.
Welcome.
I represented international students at the AUS section conference, so I was there. And something from Aberdeen that I was told a lot from the EU students was the worry of what happens to us if we leave. Also, another point I want to make is that when when I was applying coming from France to the UK, I was, rather than being told I was going to be given sort of a sort of same level as Scottish students, I was told rather the opposite, that we would have to compete much harder. So, quite frankly, telling us EU students here in Scotland had to work really hard to get here, harder I think than a lot of other students perhaps in the UK. So to be told that we were on the same sort of playing field, quite frankly, I find almost insulting, because it was not the same playing field. We had to work harder to get it, and I received an offer of only one of 3 Scottish universities, my UCAS, despite meeting all the requirements. So quite frankly, I've been insulted by saying that I was on the same level of playing field than other students.
Okay, thank you very much. So another question that came out there was, and I'd right to this side, what will happen to the EU students if we decide to leave?
Nothing. Nothing will happen to
They
EU
don't
students
know.
currently in
They
Scotland.
can't say that. They don't have a clue what's going to happen, because nobody knows what's going to happen if there's a vote for Brexit.
This is the same
We don't know
scaremongering, and we'll not have Erasmus, the university will close down, the economy will
Okay, before we dive into absolute chaos, Brady, do you want to?
I would say we don't know what happens if we vote to remain. Elections have uncertainty. We didn't know the SNP would lose the majority. We didn't know there'd be bloody 36 Tories in the Scottish Parliament.
31.
We don't we don't know. Elections have uncertainty, and what this referendum is about, though, both options have uncertainty, stay or remain. But if we leave, the power over these decisions will be taken by elected representatives that we elect, rather than people we have no control over in the Brussels.
What,
So the
there's
safest option,
51 members of the European
No.
Parliament, like the 6 of which
who have
represent
no say.
Scotland.
If you think you're
They
European,
vote on
I
every
didn't
single piece of legislation that is put in front of the
So
Parliament.
when the
They
Scottish
don't
Parliament,
control.
so when the Scottish Parliament, the SNP in 2011 were elected on a manifesto of introducing minimum pricing. The European Union ruled they're not allowed to do that, yet the Scottish people voted for it. The European Union continues to rule in areas which elected governments are represented. They force countries to have balanced budgets. The elected government in Greece was almost kicked out. The elected government in Ireland was told to vote again because they voted against the European law. If you value democracy and your vote having a say, then the only way that you can make sure that the control over the decisions, that the future of your country is in your own hands rather than unelected officials, then the only way to do that is to vote leave.
Okay, I think we'll move on. I think expanding it out from EU students into all students. Obviously, we're here to study, maybe for 4 years, maybe even for longer. Some people like me just hold on. And obviously, we want to get a job. Any employers? I'm looking. And so I think the big question that is asking is, obviously, thousands and thousands of students are leaving universities wanting to find a job, and some could argue maybe even EU membership helps them. So the open panel, I'm going to start with Bonnie. How would the panel seek to propose we as a country deal with 60,000 former students getting a job?
In the country right now, the EU Horizons 2020 programme, which is the biggest ever European Union research and innovation programme for universities and for small and medium enterprises, has a £57 billion budget from 2014 to 2020. The UK has received the highest share of grant agreements, 20%, which is way ahead of Germany, Spain, Italy and France. All of this is going into creating jobs for the future, and that's good jobs. That's jobs that the graduates are going to want to do. And actually, there's like 3 million jobs in the UK that are linked to trade with the European countries right now. In Scotland in 2011, Scotland alone, that's 336,326 jobs, which were specifically linked to the European Union. Now, I've already said that being in the EU is worth £3,000 a year for every family, according to the CBI. It's not me just making that up. That's a 10-to-1 return. Now, I would like that kind of interest on my savings. Well, I have no savings. I'm a student, I have no savings. But EU funding supports every single region. We receive billions of pounds in funding, and the Leave campaign will talk all the time about how much it's costing, but they don't talk about actually what we get back in funding for projects as well, which supports regional development, it provides investment in businesses, it creates excuse me, job opportunities, and that's not just in the cities like Dundee, where obviously it's very, very important, but actually our rural economy is incredibly important as well, and there are billions of pounds being ploughed into supporting and developing the rural economies in Scotland too. So the EU is our largest market. It compromises 44% of exports, and British exports to the EU were 229 billion in 2014. Long and short of it is, being part of the EU opens up such significant trade opportunities, such significant research opportunities, job opportunities, not just here in Scotland, but actually across the whole of the EU, where we have freedom of movement too. And I think that that is incredibly precious and something we should absolutely vote to stay in.
Okay, thank you very much. Obviously, we have Meg Brown, the business spokesperson, so obviously I can probably go to him to talk about this.
Vonnie, I mean, you talk with great passion, but again, I keep saying it's our money. It's not the European Union's money. It's our money, and I would venture to suggest Holyrood and Westminster are a far better place to decide how that money is better spent in the UK and in Scotland than EU bureaucrats. I just don't get my head around this whole EU investment. It's our money. Beyond that, in terms of trade, that will, we were trading before the European, before we joined the European Union. We don't have a trade agreement with America at the moment. We invest more money in America. We're the biggest investor in America. They're the biggest investor in us. You don't need a trade agreement. You don't need access to a single market. We will trade with them, come what may. And in terms of the options, I mean, obviously we can join the European Free Trade Association, which we founded in 1960. That would allow free trade between the UK in that association with they have a trade agreement with the European Union. We could have a free trade agreement directly with the European Union, or we could impose, we could have a tariffs regime similar to, under the auspices of the World Trade Organization. Either way, I mean, on that one, we win because we import more from Europe than they do from us. So we put about £2.5 billion up in the deal. However you look at it, we win by leaving.
Just before he responds, the question was, how would we make sure that students got jobs? If obviously you're backing leaving.
A stronger economy creates more jobs.
Pete, obviously you want to see your graduates get jobs.
On that point, we can definitely agree. What we might disagree on is how we get a stronger economy. Let me just answer the question about guests from Aberdeen. So welcome to the University of Dundee. We are actually required to have a level playing field when we look at the applicants from the EU and Scotland. How well we do that might influence ultimately what you said, but we are required to do that. So I should just make that point quite clear. So let's address this particular point. So first of all, it's very clear to us that students with a worldview are demonstrably more employable than those with a narrow and parochial view, and certainly we try to ensure that our students and our graduates have a world view. But the question really relates to your point, and that is, how do we create the conditions necessary to stimulate economic growth, and particularly economic growth that results from innovation. Now, one of the things we have to face up to in Scotland is we are one of the least innovative countries within the EU. And that lack of innovation results from a lower quartile investment in R&D across the industry of Scotland. On the other hand, we have substantial investment in R&D in our universities, and getting those two sides to click together has been a really difficult conundrum. But that's one of the advantages of EU funding, is it's extraordinarily tailored towards building coalitions amongst university researchers, business researchers, and industry. And I can give you just a couple of examples that relate to local activity that maybe give you an idea about what that means. So for example, University of Dundee had fantastic expertise in the area of drug discovery, and that led to a major consortium funding through Framework Programme 7 before Horizon 2020. £19 million of investment to create the European lead factory in Scotland. It involves multiple universities, multiple biotech and pharma companies that allows access to world-class drug discovery expertise for all of Scotland's universities and businesses. And then here in Dundee, a company called Star Dundee, which is a University Dundee spin-out led by a guy called Steve Parks, that received key European grant that put together several European companies in order to help the growth of the space industry. You may not realise, but actually Dundee is the centre of the European space industry, because the work of Star Dundee places key devices in every single satellite and space probe that goes out from the European Space Centre. So those are just two examples of how the European Union contributes to the employability of our graduates.
Okay, very, very quickly onto you, and then I want to
so-
open up to the main floor and open up to other questions as well.
One of the big things you often hear by the In campaign is 3 million jobs, but Channel 4 did a fact check, and this has been fact checked over and over again. It's absolutely nonsense. This is from a study in 1975 in America based on what NAFTA, these are what the figures are based on. Channel 4 did the fact check on it and they proved it was actually false. It's false information.
No, it's a study by the Centre for Economic and Business Research in 2014.
If you look at Channel 4's website,
I can send you the report over if you'd like to look at it, Braden, but I suspect it doesn't say what you'd want it to say, so you probably...
Okay. The other additional one is if you take a tenner from me and then you give me a fiver back, I don't go, oh, thank you, I'm a fiver up, do I? I'm still a fiver down. Like, we spend £20 billion to Brussels every year. We get about 8 to 9 billion back, 8 to 12. People will debate the numbers, but ultimately it's still billions of pounds every single year that we send to Brussels. Now that if we leave, that money can be spent in the UK, that money can be spent on research, on investment. And we heard before that, we receive all this investment money, investment's great in the European Union. Yet we even just heard from the Remain side that investment in Scotland is the worst in the European Union. So if the European Union is so fantastic for investment in Scotland, why are we at the bottom of the league already? My other question is, the European Union is a barrier to trade around the world. Like, Germany makes more from coffee exports than the whole entire continent of Africa. The reason for this is Germany erects huge barriers on the imports of manufactured products from Africa, yet levies no taxes on the imports of raw materials. So we see a situation where the European Union acts as a protectionist club for very wealthy countries. Because, as I said before, Germany makes more from exports of coffee than the continent of Africa. If we leave, we can remove the barriers to these trade. We can see prices in the UK fall. We can strike our own trade deals around the world. We see that the EU-Canada trade deal has been held up. EU-America trade deal has been held up, although thankfully for TTIP it's a horrendous trade deal, so I'm glad we're at the back of the queue for that one. But if we leave, we don't have to negotiate with 27 other countries to agree it. The reason that EU-Canada trade deal has been held up is because Romania vetoed it, because Canada still requires restrictions on visas from Romania. If we leave, these issues which affect Europe trade, we can strike our own deals with Australia. Australia negotiated free trade deal in 7 days. Now these would provide fantastic opportunities for British people, for people who live in the UK, for people in Scotland. These would provide fantastic opportunities for businesses. And also on EU regulation, only 8% of UK and Scottish businesses export to the EU. Yet 100% of businesses have to abide by all of European regulation. So farmers have to be told what crops they can or can't grow, or how high the hedges have to be, and fishermen have to be told to dump fish in the sea because it's not, the right amount of fish caught. If we leave the European Union, these decisions will be made in the Scottish Parliament, so farming, fishing. Now we'll be able to make much better decisions when these powers are closer to home. In
the 10
Hollywood.
years that it's going to take to extricate from the EU if there's going to be a Brexit.
Again, it's all just
10 years of
scaremongering.
it's not
We'll pull up the
scaremongering.
drawbridge.
You don't know how long it's going to take to
You don't know
extricate
what
from
we're
the EU.
going to stay in the
10
EU.
years of political wrangling in order to secure
You don't know how
economy.
short it could be.
You don't know how staying in the EU is going to turn out, whether Turkey will join, whether we'll have a European army, how much it'll cost for more
Okay.
Europe airlines.
So obviously I asked for a quick point, so thank you, Braden. I'm now happy to open it up to the floor, so if you could raise your hand, and I'll take questions. Yes, gentlemen over there, and then...
When I came into this room, I was fairly sure I was going to be voting to remain in the European Union. To be honest, I'm now switching. Okay? And one of the main things for that is, to me, there is a very clear contradiction between someone such as yourself arguing so national to stay in the European Union, when not 2 years ago you were arguing equally as passionately for independence from the United Kingdom. Okay? You are telling us that being in a bigger body, a bigger union of more than one country is a good thing for us, which is something I agree with in principle. So you agree with it now, but you disagree with it then. And you think that the European Parliament is so democratic and is accountable and everything like that. You did imply that earlier on.
I didn't
Well,
say that. I
yeah,
thought it was.
you
I
said
said I believe it's more
Okay,
democratic.
if you get to your question.
And I think that's what you will find in this referendum. that there will be a lot more Eurosceptic voters in Scotland. As we discovered last night, there are a lot more Tories than we thought.
You did it where it hurts.
Even for me, as someone who voted no in the independence referendum, and who probably will still vote to remain in the EU, I do think there is a clear contradiction between someone voting yes and voting to remain, when fundamentally the arguments are the same.
Okay, well, I'm going to shoot you, obviously,
Okay.
we are just in the aftermath still of an independence referendum.
Yeah, and I am definitely not here representing the Yes campaign, nor did I ever represent the Yes campaign on any platform, just to be absolutely crystal clear. I can see your point, and actually the point that you said about the EU being democratic, do I think the EU is this like wonderful, again, utopia of democratic principles? No, it's not. It absolutely needs reform, but we can reform it from within, and I absolutely believe that we can go further and we can go faster, if we're part of the EU. And the point that I was making was that the Leave campaign talk all the time about how the laws from the EU are imposed on us, and that's quite simply not true. The 751 MEPs who are democratically elected across our countries vote on every single one of those decisions. Pardon?
Like 650 MPs from across the UK. So
okay,
what is
Mark.
the difference?
The difference for me is that there's trade. And you know, I am honestly quite happy to hold up my hands and say, yeah, in this independence referendum, I voted yes, and I voted yes because as a family, we were really, really suffering under Conservative-led majority government that had cut away all of the things that made sure that I could support my family. Now, those things are still present within the EU, and I would have voted to remain within the EU in an independent Scotland were it ever to happen. But I honestly and passionately believe that the trade opportunities, the freedom of movement, and the ability to be able to move my family to France or Italy and get a job there if I can't get a job here is something that's incredibly, incredibly important. I can understand why you compare the two, but I genuinely believe they are two very, very different situations. The one thing I wanted to pick up on in terms of employment, which I missed earlier on, was actually we talk about the benefits of working in different countries and being able to travel around for jobs. What we haven't talked about is actually how the EU employment directives protect workers against discrimination on the basis of age, of race, of sexual orientation and more. It's the EU employment directives that ensure that women and men are treated equally at work, that pregnant people are considered and protected, and that maternity and parental leave is available. It ensures that employees have rights around their contracts, that they have to have time off between shifts, and a maximum number of hours in a working week, and that employees have the right to be consulted with changes to their contracts. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention as well, which I think is one final thing, which is incredibly important, and I touched on it in my opening remarks. The European Union grew out of a desire for peace in a war-torn and divided continent. 5 years after World War II ended, France and Germany came up with a plan to ensure their two countries would never go to war with each other again. It was a noble initiative and one that we should be proud of. And the thing is, that it is the European Charter for Human Rights which underpins the entire peace process in Northern Ireland. And I think that we have to be very, very cautious of the ramifications of what a Brexit would mean, not just for us here in Scotland, but actually could mean the end of the peace process in Northern Ireland as well.
Okay.
I'm very, very passionate. Peace is
I just want to move over to Mev. Can we reform the EU if we stay inside it? I think was the number of question.
To give you a little bit of history, Business for Britain was set up as a pressure group to identify the reforms necessary to make the European Union work. This is what we came up with. It's over 1,000 pages. The Prime Minister's reforms could be written on the back of an envelope. Europe does not want to. They're not going to reform. They're just not. They're not interested. They really aren't. To suggest that they are is ridiculous. I mean, Yanis Varoufakis recently said that the biggest, in fact, he said Europe represented a clear and present danger to the global economy because of its unwillingness to reform. Today, the European Union is printing something in the region of 80 billion euros a month to keep their economies afloat. And they've introduced negative interest rates. That is a recipe for disaster. They will pay the price for that in due course. And to me, they are the most likely trigger for the next recession. Europe is not. They're just not going to reform. They've got no interest. We need to get away from them.
Okay, I've got one final question, I'm afraid, just in terms of time. Stuart, man in the white shirt. Down a bit. There we go.
I hope you know.
I'd like to bring a question. Just, you know, video me this. I'd like to bring the question back to the employment and jobs. 2 years ago, I worked in a Scottish Government department called Scottish Enterprise, and part of my main responsibility there was to attract foreign investment in Scotland. And as I'm sure most of us know, that attraction of foreign investment into any economy is near the top of the priority of almost any country in the planet. And part of the message that we would use in terms of our marketing to foreign companies, and by the way, foreign company actually included those from England as well. They were classed as foreign from the Scottish Government. I wonder why. Part of that was in terms of access to Europe. And I think you mentioned, Mr. Brown, earlier that America is a big investor in the UK. And one of the reasons American companies do that is because, partly because of the language and the access it gives them to the EU. It makes it very easy, it makes it very easy for them to trade into the EU. Similarly, you get similar pressures coming from, or incentives from China and South American countries. They're coming to the UK and they're already established in the UK. Japan is now coming here because of that access to the EU. And so the question I would have for you is that if we were to leave the EU, how would you overcome the damage that would do to the loss of investment coming from overseas countries?
Well, first I wouldn't suggest that there's going to be any loss of investment.
Well, I know I do know, because I have talked to leaders of already established foreign companies in this country, and they would have to re-establish headquarters in Europe in order to make the trade easier. So they're already looking at like plan Bs to actually have to move staff and open up investment in Europe.
I would accept that some companies will have to set up EU subsidiaries, depending on the market sector that they operate in. But the biggest attraction for foreign investment is the tax rate in the UK. At the moment it's 20%, and it's going to be going down to 18% in 2020. If you look at France, Germany, Spain, Italy, the other major economies in Europe, they're between 20 and 33%. So if you're going to work in a foreign country, where do you want to work?
Brilliant. Quickly over to you, and then I'll...
I struggle to agree with this argument. I would say I'm left wing, but I come at this from a different viewpoint. I'm sceptical that big American corporations really have the interests of the workers in the UK at heart. I'm very sceptical that that's what they care about more. And it's based on the assumption that we'd lose access to the trade with Europe. That's not what anyone's suggesting. Why would the UK, if it happened as David Cameron's campaign would have you believe that we drop the drawbridge and we wouldn't trade with Europe? No one's suggesting that. Why would the UK be the only country in between the Atlantic Ocean and the border with Russia that doesn't trade? Turkey trades freely, Albania trades freely, Switzerland trades freely. All these countries trade freely in the common area. And we're not suggesting we leave that. Trade is good, we agree with that. But also the European Union hasn't proved very beneficial to the steel workers at Port Talbot, who we were ruled we can't protect their jobs or we can't provide state aid because the European Union bans it. The EU bans trade unions from going on strike if their jobs are moved to another European country because it's classed as the freedom of movement, freedom of capital. The EU doesn't facilitate money being shipped offshore, again, because of the freedom of movement, the freedom of capital. We can ship money anywhere around the European Union. So I question that if we leave the European Union, we're much better able to protect workers and ultimately wages will go up. And as David Cameron's campaign has even said, wages would go up if we left the European Union. The head of Marks and Spencer's has said that's a fact. And I think workers as a whole would benefit with increased wages, increased ability to protect employment rights because these powers would be held by the Scottish Parliament and the UK Parliament. I think that's one of the big reasons why voting to leave would benefit workers in Scotland and around the UK.
Okay. Pete.
I pledged that I would restrict my comments to things that relate to higher education, particularly because that's one of the requirements of charity law as it applies to the contributions that those in particular positions might make. But I am speaking as an individual and from my own personal perspective. I think a number of comments have been made, prefaced with the term "that's a fact." I actually don't think there are many established facts in all of this. I think we have to make judgments based upon the best available evidence for much of what we're talking about. And when I think about these things, I just think about the scale of Europe, the size of its economy, the things like freedom of movement, freedom of employment across those boundaries. I think about those countries that have been quoted as having access to all that without any of the problems through things like associated country status and bilateral agreements like Switzerland. And actually, what those countries have is they pay for that relationship, generally in proportion to their GDP, and they get no influence on the decisions that are made within that huge market. So, you know, I'm not, those things, those elements are facts, but how those facts and the very many things that we've talked about will pan out into the complex issue of what the economic advantages and disadvantages are very difficult to determine. So I come back to gut feeling and what's important to me. And what's important to me is I feel part of a group of countries called Europe. And I think they're very, very important. I think the peace issue is a fantastically important issue. I think freedom of movement as a right is a fantastically important issue. And I think that those things feed into a culture which is both socially positive, but also, I believe, stimulates economic growth and development in ways that a parochial approach would not. If I can make one final comment, and I'll then shut up and not say anything else, and that is this a referendum involves a vote for an outcome that will last for the foreseeable future, depending on how you look at certain referendums. But this one for sure will. And therefore it's vital that young people in particular, who will have to live with this decision for much of the rest of their lives, go out and vote. Do not be complacent. Students from this university, I hope, will do us all proud by getting out there and whatever their view is, voting in this referendum.
Bonnie, finally over to you, and then I'll be unfortunately closing the debate for the evening.
I mean, I don't really feel like I have an awful lot to add to what Pete said. I think for me, the issue of sustaining peace in the continent of Europe is incredibly important, and I think that actually something that I am very, very lucky, as is my generation, to take for granted, because we've never had to experience the absolute horror of a world war the way that previous generations have. And I think as well, I talked a little bit about the European Employment Directives and the protection that we have from those, but actually there's also a number of other, for example, the European Charter of Human Rights, which enshrines our rights in a way that at the moment there is no equivalent in the rest of the UK. And the EU is Britain's biggest trading partner, and currently it is really easy to live and work in the EU. It's really easy to just decide, you know what, I've actually managed to save up a little bit of money from my job, I'm going to go and take a wee holiday to Prague, or I'm going to pop over to Paris, and it's simple. And as I said in my opening speech, I think that those cultural and social benefits, you can't put a price tag on those, you can't evaluate those into a nice little plan, but they mean an awful lot, and they develop you as a person in such a fantastic way. And I think that actually we perhaps don't talk enough about those benefits. But I think that we have to be willing to accept that we can all live and work across the continent. That is what our generation is going to have to be able to do. And this means people with the right skills from Europe being able to come here and to support our economy here, but also people from here, from our highly skilled universities and colleges, being able to travel and experience things across Europe as well. And so being part of the EU, for me, is the only buffer that we have to protect students and communities from regressive Tory policy set at Westminster as well. For example, funding from the European Social Fund promotes employment, promotes social inclusion. I mentioned earlier on that that fund actually supports every single college in Scotland to deliver programmes for widening access and for getting people back into education who otherwise might not have had that option. It currently funds projects and work across the UK, which makes sure that disadvantaged groups have fairer life opportunities, and that fairer part is so absolutely crucial. I don't want to sit as someone talking about the benefits to Scotland of being part of the EU. I want to talk about the benefits of the EU having a wide and varied membership that supports each of our members in order to be treated fairly and for their societies to develop as well. And so I'll even say, I really hope that you will vote, but particularly hope that you will vote to remain in the EU.
Okay, thank you very much. Final few words before we finally do end. Does anybody wish to take them out?
I mean, business is all about solving problems and charging a fee. The whole notion that we'll have any kind of real problem in trading with Europe after we leave is, to me, it's just too ridiculous to contemplate. And again, there's a number of options that will be open and negotiable between the UK and Europe once we leave. In terms of, you know, I mean, and again, without wanting to repeat myself, nobody's talking about ending the Erasmus programme or anything of that sort. And again, you know, everything's negotiable. You know, again, when I used to recruit people to work in the UK, you know, you looked at visa programmes from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and, you know, the ANZAC countries plus South Africa. You basically filled out a form for a visa, and you could work in the UK for 2 years, no questions.
It's not like that.
Okay.
Can I say one sentence?
Just one final sentence, and then that will be it, I promise. You can all go.
In this referendum, if you want your elected politicians to ultimately make the decisions about how Scotland, how the UK, how whatever is run, the only way you can do that and make sure the power is in our hands as voters is by voting leave, and that's what I'll leave it with.
Punchy, thank you. Okay, so that unfortunately does end the debate. It's the final also debate in our Neverendum series. Just while we finish it, I'd actually like to thank Dom to the left here mainly. It's been mainly his brainchild throughout the whole year. So I'd like everyone to put their hands together, please. It's been an absolute pleasure. I mean, the TV cameras have made me feel like I've been on an episode of Jeremy Kyle. Don't know who's who in that scenario. So I'd also like to thank DUSA TV, DUSA Radio for live streaming. It means that you, see I'm looking at the camera now, you can actually watch at home. It will be put up online later if you want to look over the argument. So big round of applause to DUSA TV and DUSA Radio as well. And finally, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming tonight. It's been really good to see people getting involved. And as Pete said earlier, the importance of voting really cannot be overrated. We just went through an election recently, and the turnout, I can't remember what the turnout specifically, 51%. That's not good enough. We need to get higher. Okay, and for something that is so important, like the EU referendum, it does need to be, everyone needs to go out and vote. So I'd just like to say, enjoy the rest of your evening. I'm sure some panel members might be happy to stick around and answer any more questions you may have. But thank you for coming. Thank you.